In this week's episode of Bleach the 1000-Year Blood War arc, the allied heroes invade Wahrwelt, Uryū commands his Schutzstaffel into battle, and Renji takes on Uryū in a shocking fight to the death. Wow. Wow. It is safe to say the Wahrwelt arc is off to a very strong start. I am really excited for what the team can do here moving forward. It almost feels like they are working with a blank slate. And obviously that isn't the case, and even here in this episode, we've stuck pretty faithfully to the source material for much of the runtime, but it's just when they do add something new, they really add something new. This isn't a minor detail or small tweak to a plot beat, no, this is yet another completely new fight with an outcome that has ramifications for the rest of the arc to follow. During the predictions part of my episode 32 review, I speculated the anime team would have some time to fill in this episode because I thought the episode might end with the start of the Friend Saga. How wrong I was about that. But they did indeed have time to play around with, and that resulted in this new, roughly 10-minute long fight between Renji and Uryū, another substantial addition to this core's growing list of brand new battles. Plotting out where the rest of this core is likely to go, I'm not sure whether there is really room for more new fights on this kind of scale. The Mayuri versus Pernida and Kyoraku versus Lille battles are likely to be 2 episodes apiece, I imagine, while the Friend Saga has the potential to be expanded too, rounding out the core as a surprising but emotional finale. Certainly last week, I didn't think the Friend Saga would cap things off here, but it is looking more and more likely. Perhaps the only other new fight we might receive that I can foresee at the moment anyway is something along the lines of Ichigo versus Askin, or even Ichigo and Grimmjow versus Askin, based on what occurred in this week's episode, but we'll get to that a bit later. Instead, let's focus on the here and now. This was another absolutely standout episode of Bleach, featuring action sequences in particular that go beyond much of what we've seen from the series before. There's lots to love here and just as much to discuss. So, as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, episode 33, titled Gate of the Sun, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. However guys, before we get started, once you are done with this video, if you enjoyed it, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below, as it really does help me out, and I really do appreciate the support. Let's get started then, and as always, we'll first take a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode in order to get a lay of the land. And as expected, we are now firmly in the territory of things being much more streamlined and frankly, easier to keep up with. In fact, this episode may feature the smallest number of included chapters yet, as we circumvent the entire Friend Saga and fill that space with the brand new fight. As a result, the pacing continues to feel excellent in this core. The overall rushed feelings of cores 1 and 2 is definitely a thing of the past. So, without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 33. First, we have chapter 629, Gate of the Sun, the title of this week's episode. Chapter 630, The Twinned Twilight. And finally, chapter 635, Hooded Enigma. So like I said, not many chapters at all, but it gets even crazier than that. Out of the 3 chapters listed here, chapter 629, Gate of the Sun, is adapted in full, pretty much from start to finish without missing a beat. But after that, the episode contains maybe only a quarter of chapter 630 and only half of chapter 635. So once again, we've got an episode that is made up of almost 50% entirely new material, and that is such an exciting prospect. To be honest, even though we can roughly plot out the route for the remainder of the core, I'm still optimistic that there's going to be time enough for more episodes to be structured in this way. Speaking of the episode's structure, well, there's not too much else to say about it. In my predictions from last week, I noted that I thought they might be collapsing chapters 630 and 635 into one, and they did exactly that, which I think is a smart move. But it does leave the Friend saga up in the air for the time being, which is a fascinating choice on the anime team's part. You have to wonder why they would choose to, presumably, make Friend the conclusion of Part 3. The only reason I can think of is that perhaps something will happen in that battle, something new, that will lead directly into Part 4, or have major ramifications for those final 13 episodes. A part of me wonders if Uryū will run into Hashwolf immediately in the aftermath of him killing Basby, and then of course that will kickstart Uryū versus Hashwolf, which will of course hopefully be a major through line throughout Part 4, but we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, let's dive into the spoiler analysis for the 1000 Year Blood War arc episode 33, titled Gate of the Sun. This is gonna be a good one, I think. The episode begins in a fantastic way, as the central fortress of Wahrwelt rises up before the Gotei 13, as seen at the conclusion of last week's episode. We are taken up to one of the stronghold's highest points in a sweeping shot that scales the mountainous castle. In a new scene, the anime briefly reintroduces each member of the Schutzstaffel, who, interestingly, haven't been referred to by that collective name yet in the anime at all, by the way, as we see them standing atop one of the castle's main towers, each of them positioned at the individual points of a giant Vandenreich emblem. The camera then takes us up into the sky, giving us a bird's eye view of Wahrwelt's central city in its entirety, including the multi-layered castle centered right in the eye of the nation. Once again, I have to point out that this is an extraordinarily dense and enormous cityscape for what really amounts to a handful of Quincy at the end of the day. As the image of Wahrwelt fades away, the central platform is replaced by an ornate emblem engraved into the stone. This marking is a Gate of the Sun, the Vandenreich's portal-like network, their unique method of moving around their landscape. It should be noted that the ability to use shadows and Gates of the Sun are in fact two different transportation methods, and until now we'd never directly seen a Gate of the Sun used at all, despite multiple characters actually accessing them to move around throughout the arc. As the Gates emblem turns, the title of this week's episode flashes into life around it before locking into the stone itself in a really cool effect. Returning to our new introduction for the Schutzstaffel, Yhwach appears in his throne room and calls out the name of each member in turn, beginning with the leader of the guard, Lille Barro. Lille is seen holding his Quincy cross for the first time ever, which is a cool detail. Gerard is next, and the Quincy raises his fist to his chest in a salute. The position of his fist is also likely a reference to his true nature as the vessel of the Soul King's heart. Third is Pernida, and this is definitely the weirdest moment of the lot in this intro. As Yhwach calls Pernida's name, we see the hooded Quincy's eyes converge, coming together to form a Quincy cross, even going so far as to change colour to adopt the appearance completely. This is incredibly weird, given what we know of Pernida itself. Underneath its hood, the left arm does have a giant eye, with two irises centered in the middle of its palm, the palm of the hand, but this image implies the two irises fuse together briefly and somehow create the image of a cross. I'm not sure if we're meant to take this particularly seriously, particularly literally, or if it's just supposed to hint at the fact that Pernida considers itself to be a true Quincy at heart. It's possible this is something new the anime team has added in general, and Pernida's eye will be capable of all sorts of weirdness, or it might just be symbolic. Next up is Askin, who is much simpler. He fixes his hair with a smirk, before we then see Uryū, who also readies himself, his Quincy cross in hand. It's possible, thinking about it, that these individual character shots are just meant to be showing us each Schutzstaffel member's Quincy cross. Gerard places a hand on his heart because that's where his cross resides, while perhaps Pernida's cross is in actuality within its eye? Or maybe, as I said, it's meant to reference the Quincy power dwelling within the arm. Askin doesn't reveal his Quincy cross here either, but we know it's in his bracelet, which we do see here. I don't know, either way, it's a really cool scene. It is weird though. Yhwach appears to be addressing his men in his throne room, as we also saw at the end of last week's episode. However, when he orders them to fill a chalice with their enemy's blood, they respond to him while atop the tower outside. Regardless, that line of Yhwach's is extremely cool, as he tells the Schutzstaffel to toast the birth of their new Welt. At this, their individual gates activate, and each of the Schutzstaffel disappear in a shimmer of blue sparks, teleporting across Wahrwelt to confront the invaders. Again, it's really cool to finally see a sun gate being used. The visual effect is awesome, and I love knowing the Schutzstaffel gathered just before going their separate ways. It's a bit of a shame we didn't get just a little more of them actually interacting as a team, but there you go. There is one other thing as well. In chapter 660, Uryū gives Ichigo and the others a sun key, supposedly needed to access the sun gates, yet here, no one uses one. Perhaps they've been removed from the anime, or maybe the sun key is only necessary for people that aren't Quincy, although in the manga, Uryū does explain that the sun key is used by the sternritter to access the sun gates, so I have no idea. After the opening, we find ourselves at the beginning of chapter 629, following on immediately from where we left off at the end of episode 32. In an exchange taken straight from the manga, Kyoraku and Kisuke discuss Yhwach's new towering castle, with Kyoraku noting that it's meant to display the enemy's strength while beckoning the Gotei 13 to challenge them at the same time. In a new scene, Kyoraku then addresses the turncoat sternritter trio, who immediately shut him down. Basby tells Kyoraku that they don't have any intention of working with or taking orders from the Shinigami, which makes sense. While it makes sense that the two sides would simply part ways here, I'm almost a little surprised that the Gotei 13 don't press this advantage they have a bit more. Is there really no information at all they'd like to get from the sternritter before they go? Either way, Kyoraku orders the Shinigami to move out, and we get a couple of really cool shots showing virtually every single character gathered in one place. It's an impressive grouping, to say the least, though looking at this particular shot, it is also kind of insane just how quickly the numbers get whittled down in this episode alone. After watching the Shinigami leave, the sternritter then disappear into the shadows so they can move towards Silburn. Except, this seems like a potential mistake to me. I'm not sure that's how the shadows should work. How are the sternritter using the shadows in Wahrwelt? I thought the idea of travelling through the shadows only applied to the Serete, as that was where the Vandenreich built their hidden world, as a reflection, a flip side, of the Serete itself. Wahrwelt, which is completely separate, shouldn't work like that. Having said that, Eburn disappears into a shadow in the human world, though I have a feeling that was before Kubo finalised how the shadows might actually work. Interestingly, the source material seems to reinforce this. Basby and the others don't use the shadows to approach Silburn in chapter 629, but a Gate of the Sun. The Gate of the Sun that the chapter in question was originally named after. Here, all references to them using a sun gate are gone entirely. The episode then skips ahead and gives us a new scene of Ichigo, Yoruichi and the others taking off for the castle themselves, leaving a brooding Grimmjow behind momentarily. I'm not sure what this is all about. Is he meant to be having second thoughts about working with them? It's odd because in the end he ends up running alongside them anyway, like he was doing in the original chapter. Next we double back through chapter 629 once more, watching as the Gotei 13 sprint through the Quincy streets as a complete unit. We get a couple of nice shots here of the characters, including one of Omaida and Hachi, that I always thought was a nice little reference to their battle with Baragon in the Fate Karakura Town arc. Kisuke suddenly realises that Mayuri is missing, to which we then cut over to a completely different branch of Wahrwelt. Continuing on with chapter 629, a gold light flashes amidst the city streets as a second divine gate opens. Emerging from the gleaming doorway, Mayuri and Nemu step out onto Wahrwelt, with Mayuri having hung back from the rest of the Gotei 13 before tilting the gate's axis, allowing him to arrive at a totally different location from everyone else. With a diabolical grin creasing his face, Mayuri gleefully notes that now he's free of everyone else, he'll finally be able to test the results of his research, when suddenly who but Kenpachi Zaraki should step out of the gate behind him. Mayuri turns in complete shock, absolutely horrified to see Kenpachi of all people has thwarted his plan, completely unwittingly. It's a great comedic moment, and Mayuri's perfect expression is captured wonderfully here in the anime. Kenpachi reveals that everyone left without him while he was in the bathroom, but luckily he caught sight of Mayuri's gate just in time. It does kind of make me laugh that no one in the Gotei thought to think of Kenpachi, despite him being one of their strongest warriors by far. Kisuke remembers Mayuri, but no one remembers Kenpachi apparently. A lot of the people in the comments of my reaction earlier this week were pointing out their apparent surprise that Kenpachi washes his hands after going to the bathroom. And I'm like, firstly, he's not an animal, let's give him some benefit of the doubt, and secondly, he does that in the manga too, which is a fun detail. I am intrigued by the room that Mayuri opens his gate in. It doesn't look like his laboratory at all, so I'm wondering if it's the interior of that gigantic, disgusting plinth he raised from beneath the ground a few episodes back. Kenpachi notes that it was lucky they found Mayuri, turning to none other than Hanataro, who looks completely despondent to find himself with this crew in particular, Ikkaku and Yumichika also emerging through the gate behind the medic. Kenpachi and Mayuri's following standoff is taken directly from the manga, with Kenpachi happily noting that without the others around, he can go all out without worrying, especially considering he knows that Mayuri won't die so easily if he's accidentally caught up in the fighting. With a mad look on his face, Mayuri fights back, saying that perhaps now he has the opportunity to get rid of a few annoying pests without anyone being around to notice. These two characters work extremely well together. They're very much opposites, in the fact that Mayuri is a mad scientist, often holed up in his lab, while Kenpachi is a fight-loving brute who wants to be nowhere but the front lines. And yet those two extremes mesh better than you might think. They both have a totally different worldview, and both are completely impervious to outside influence for the most part, and neither one really knows the definition of fear. Mayuri is one of very few characters capable of sparring with Kenpachi verbally without any concern or worry whatsoever, and Kenpachi often gives as good as he gets, leading these two very strong personalities to feel like natural rivals. Mayuri feels like a more tightly wound and worked up version of Byakuya, if you can believe it, almost in this sense, someone who can stand shoulder to shoulder with Kenpachi, leading to some great interactions. Hanataro's utter misery at finding himself with these complete monsters is funny, but I find it even funnier that when Kenpachi rallies the men to run with him, Hanataro is right there, ready to charge into battle with the beastly captain. We then head back over to Ichigo and the gang as we continue through chapter 629. Like I said, that chapter is covered head to toe here in the episode. That being said, a comedic moment is removed from the manga here, where Ichigo is revealed to have also tried to jump off the edge of the city like Yushiro and nearly plummeted to his death, only to be saved by Chad. Instead, the gang discusses their inability to meet up with Rukia and Renji, with Chad noting that they are all likely to converge eventually. However, Grimmjow interjects, saying they don't need to meet up with anyone, as the larger the group becomes, the less mobile they are as a unit, meaning more unnecessary bodies in the fold. Admittedly, this is a surprisingly sensible line of thinking coming from Grimmjow of all characters, even if it is born out of the misguided desire to want to take on the entire Quincy army all by himself. And, clearly hoping to do just that, Grimmjow decides to go on without the rest of them, but Ichigo suddenly realises that there is someone up ahead. It's my boy Askin, who, in a somewhat meta moment, grumbles about his bad luck in running into Ichigo Kurosaki's group. In the manga, he follows this up by remarking that it's at least better than having to face the entire Gotei 13, but that's removed here. Instead, Grimmjow immediately jumps him and destroys Askin's tower with a vicious slash attack, collapsing it in a column of dust and debris. It's at this point that we skip right ahead to chapter 635, as we see Gerard Valkyrie stampeding through his chosen part of Wahrwelt, only to find there's absolutely no one there at all. While this scene is essentially the same as in the manga, the dialogue is different. In the manga, Gerard calls out his fellow Schutzstaffel members for giving him the short end of the stick, but in the anime he issues a bellowing challenge to the Gotei 13, telling them to come and get him all at once. Another tease of his ability, the miracle. We also get a really cool shot of the central fortress here as the camera pans out from Gerard. At this point, we then skip back to the cliffhanger of chapter 629, where we see Basby, Lil Toto, and Giselle having arrived at Silburn itself. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there is no reference to them using a sun gate whatsoever, and as a result, I'm not sure Lil Toto's dialogue really makes sense now that they're using the shadows. When a Quincy uses the shadows to travel, I always thought that they must have known where they were going. In fact, it would be strange if they didn't. However, the sun gates would have had predetermined routes, which is why she notes that although the cityscape has changed, they still managed to come out near Silburn, implying they weren't sure they would make it easily. Either way, I like Giselle's new line where she shouts that they are home. It is weirdly confrontational. But as we reach the end of chapter 629, Basby says they'll settle the score with Yhwach and Hashwolf, as we see Hashwolf standing in front of something. Yes, this is the famous red portal shot from the earlier trailer, perhaps the first shot of the new core to really make me wonder what on earth was going on. In a totally brand new shot, Hashwolf is seen standing in front of a brilliant, rippling red circle that definitely appears to be a portal of sorts in a room that, judging by the bridge and the ceiling, seems purposefully designed to hold it. Now, when speculating on the trailer many months back, I and others came to the conclusion that this must have been a Gate of the Sun, perhaps the Gate of the Sun designed to facilitate the invasion into the living world, as mentioned later on by Hashwolf. However, as of this very episode, we now know that isn't the case. We've seen the Sun Gates now, and they don't look like this. And in my opinion, that means that we are now on the more exciting avenue. This could now be something totally new, and that is fascinating to think about. So, with the Sun Gate theory out of the window, what exactly could this portal be? Is it even a portal at all? Could it be a communications device, a way to speak to Yhwach directly perhaps? Maybe the red colour is bleeding through from the throne room. Admittedly, that seems a little unlikely to me, though. Perhaps it's not a portal, but a mirror of sorts. Maybe this will be what facilitates the friend flashback, and it's a weird Quincy device that lets them, I don't know, access memories, see the past. I've got no idea. Or maybe it is a portal, a much bigger standalone sun gate designed to invade the living world, as is suggested in the manga. As you can see, I don't have a clue. Watch it turn out to be nothing like that at all, but that's the fun of these elements that are completely unknown to us. And either way, I'm extremely excited to see what's going on with it. We then find ourselves at the beginning of chapter 630, and in the aftermath of Grimmjow's brutal assault. As Grimmjow stands over the decimated tower, Ichigo and the others catch up, with Ichigo snapping at the Espada for attacking recklessly. When Grimmjow replies in kind, remarking that he isn't taking orders from Ichigo, Askin suddenly emerges from the rubble and takes off. This entire sequence is ripped straight from the manga, almost panel for panel, which is wonderful to see. After a brief comedic moment with Ichigo, Grimmjow gives chase, following the sternritter into the darkened streets ahead. As Askin says he'll stop running if Grimmjow promises not to kill him, Grimmjow muses that he never said he'd kill him, only that if Askin is weaker than him, well, he'll end up dead anyway. Grimmjow wonders why Askin is running if he's here to fight, but Askin simply says that he hasn't come to fight, he's come to kill them, and if he can do that sneakily without getting hurt, then that's all the better. I absolutely love the new little shot of Askin running backwards around the corner while facing Grimmjow. If anything, that makes it feel like he is goading the Espada into chasing him a lot more. But this is such a good exchange between two unlikely characters. Askin asks who Grimmjow is, to which Grimmjow replies that he's Ichigo's enemy. Happy to hear it, Askin proposes they join forces to kill Ichigo together, but Grimmjow isn't having it. It's great because Askin is exactly the kind of enemy that Grimmjow hates. A sneaky, tricky guy who isn't straightforward, one who would rather run than fight, while Grimmjow is exactly the kind of enemy that Askin must love. Someone who blindly runs into his realm and is almost certainly going to fall for anything that Askin pulls. Slamming his hand into the floor, Grimmjow unleashes a partial form of his resurrection, transforming his hands into black claws, and then seemingly using them to pounce towards Askin, making enormous strides as he gains on the sternritter rapidly. In a great little moment again, seeing Grimmjow's face turned up in a maniacal grin, Askin screams as he continues to run. I never really thought about it before, as the two scenes aren't portrayed back to back like this in the manga, but the fact that Askin still somehow manages to get away from Grimmjow here, even if only briefly, is a bit jarring. And speaking of which, we skip ahead again, back to chapter 635, as Ichigo and the gang have totally lost sight of Grimmjow now. Deciding to split up, they go their separate ways, only for the camera to pan upwards, revealing that Askin is hiding on a rooftop overlooking them. Sighing with relief, Askin sits back onto the floor, and we're introduced to the most iconic Bleach character since Chair Summer, Askin's Cafe au Lait, as the sternritter decides to take a quick break and have a drink while coming up with a plan. Unbeknownst to him, Grimmjow is of course standing right behind him. I'm so glad that this scene was left in completely untouched. Not only is it a great piece of comedy, but it's a fantastic character moment for Askin in general. After we were robbed of his picnic basket in Core 2, this is great to see. Realising Grimmjow is right there, Askin flees the scene again, darting across the rooftop. Grimmjow dashes after him, to which Askin says that he will give Grimmjow a gift, flinging a sinister-looking purple orb into the sky towards the Espada. Scoffing, Grimmjow says there is no way he's falling for a lame attack like that, as he swats the orb away, destroying it in an explosion of purple sparks. Unfortunately for Grimmjow, this is exactly what Askin wanted him to do. The poison immediately enters Grimmjow's system, shocking the Espada as he crumples to the ground, completely paralysed. The anime team goes one step further in highlighting his humiliation by having one leg stuck up in the air just for fun. With Grimmjow totally helpless, Askin doubles back and informs him the gift ball is filled with poison, and that he shouldn't accept gifts from strangers, remarking that Grimmjow's decision to do so was a fatal mistake. Honestly, I think the anime handled this entire interaction between Grimmjow and Askin exceptionally well, collapsing the two moments together from chapters 630 and 635 makes a lot of sense in the context of how the episode plays out, and it is awesome to see it completely untouched here from the manga. Continuing on through chapter 635, we see Lille adjusting his sniper rifle as he sets up in his vantage point, the incoming Gotei 13 officers firmly in his sights. Lille is perhaps the Schutzstaffel member who showcases the true terror of Wahrwelt as a setting the best, and how the Quincy have deployed the environment to be totally disadvantageous to the Shinigami. Unable to create footholds, the Gotei 13 are forced to run the streets, being funneled towards Lille and his gun, while also being completely unaware of his presence. Lille moves his crosshairs over each individual member of the Gotei 13, scoping out who the best target is. He notes that the group is slowly breaking apart due to a number of factors: individual stamina, each Shinigami's ability to adapt to the high-density reishi, and of course, the extent of their injuries. Now, I will say, it makes a little less sense for Lille to ready his shot on Hisagi while highlighting his injuries when Hisagi is no longer covered in bandages. In the manga, Hisagi is still wrapped up almost head to toe, and he's sweating and panting, trying to keep up. Here in the anime, Hisagi looks perfectly capable and well, in my opinion, and it doesn't really make sense that Lille would single him out first. But he does, and with an intake of breath to steady his gun, a very nice little detail here in the episode, Lille fires. Interestingly, Lille isn't using the X-axis here, he's actually firing bullets, which wasn't the case in the chapter, or at least not that we could see. The bullet, which is barely a flash of blue, slams into Hisagi, blowing through his shoulder and blasting out of his lower hip, destroying his body in one quick shot. Hisagi collapses backwards in a pool of blood, and it's here where this scene goes completely crazy. As far as the source material goes, that's it for this sequence, but the anime takes things a few steps further, in a way that I think is just fantastic. As everyone realises that Hisagi is suddenly down, Omaida and Kiyone make the mistake of turning back and heading towards him. In a genuinely haunting moment, Omaida is next to be casually shot, this time through the back as he runs towards Hisagi, also crumpling to the ground in a splatter of blood. Omaida being taken out happens in such a nonchalant way that it really is crazy to behold. Next up is Kiyone, who Lille snipes straight through the chest, blood spraying from her wound. As she looks down in horror at the new hole formed in her torso, blood dribbles from her mouth before she too collapses. Honestly, this one looks like a kill shot to me. I know that all of these characters survive somehow unless big changes are coming, but Kiyone should be dead from this, in my opinion. That bullet has gone right through her heart. It is the exact same place that Uetsu was shot through in the royal palace, and he needed Senjumaru's immediate attention in order to survive. And with no healers to come to her aid at all, it really seems unlikely to me that Kiyone would be quite so lucky. Realising someone has them pinned, Kyoraku orders the officers to just keep moving, but two more turn back. Isane and Sentaro rush towards Kiyone. Let's face it, they're not headed for Omaida, but in an incredible shot before Kyoraku can do anything about it, two more bullets zip from a nearby tower, ripping straight through Isane and Sentaro and sending them crashing to the ground. And so, just like that, in the space of a truly terrifying couple of minutes, the Gotei 13 have lost Hisagi, Omaida, Kyone, Isane, and Sentaro, seriously thinning the pack right from the off. In the manga, we only see Hisagi get shot. Later, the surviving officers discuss the fact that a lot of other characters have since been picked off, but we never knew who for certain or how, and were left to kind of figure it all out ourselves. Here, it is awesome that the anime took the time to not only show who goes down, but to do so in a truly brutal, relentless, unforgiving and shocking fashion. This is exactly how a villain's power should be portrayed, especially in the midst of a war. No one is really given a chance to survive. Those who make even the slightest mistake here are sniped. It is really just a great sequence from start to finish. However, there are a couple of additional points too. Firstly, Soifon wasn't sniped. This might seem obvious, but it's at this point in the manga that Soifon vanishes from the arc entirely, never to be seen again until the epilogue. And so for years, the community collectively figured that she must have been another of Lille's victims, even if it didn't make much sense for one of the Soul Society's fastest warriors to be taken out like that. Now we just need to see if the anime has any plans for her at all moving forward, but at the very least, so far, they've still remembered her. Secondly, Omaida was sniped. Whereas in the manga, he makes a blink and you'll miss it appearance at the start of the battle with Gerard, only to vanish after that. I will say, considering that this is likely to be the last time we will ever see these characters until the epilogue, unless there is something new towards the end of the story, I imagine it is a little disappointing if you are a fan of some of these characters to see them go down so quickly here in the final battle. I feel like Isane in particular perhaps deserved to stick around a little bit longer, especially with her becoming a captain after the war is over, but alas, Hanataro is now the only remaining member of Squad 4 involved in the battle. Interestingly, the anime gives us a cool new shot of the Gotei 13 splitting up and heading in different directions as they disappear down various streets. I think this is probably how the anime will explain Kisuke and Yushiro arriving to help Yoruichi later, and perhaps even Soifon will come along for the ride too. In the manga, Kisuke is with the Gotei 13 right up until they're confronted by Gerard, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, as it implies he then just runs away and leaves them to be destroyed. Before the scene ends, we get a new line from Lille where he calls them sinful people, a reference to his upcoming battle with Kyoraku and his position as God's messenger, wherein he starts referring to everyone as sinful, basically. But yeah, sitting back, I think I have to say that that was a masterfully executed sequence. The anime takes a total blind spot in the manga, not knowing who exactly was taken out and how, and transforms it into a fantastic and exciting portion of the episode. Were it not for the big fight that happens, this would absolutely be the highlight for its sheer uncompromising brutality. I love it. This really does feel like a war zone, and it won't be long before Kyoraku takes the fight to their attacker. However, we only follow one of the Gotei 13 officers from this point onwards, Renji, as he disappears down one of the nearby streets. From above, he's suddenly set upon by a volley of arrows, but it's not Lille. Emerging from the darkness is none other than Uryū, lifting his bright blue bow, his familiar spiritual pressure shocking the other Shinigami. However, in a moment that really shows, in my opinion, why Renji is the resolute soldier that he is, he seems to immediately know what to do. Despite the fact that he's facing down Uryū, the vice-captain leaps into action, bounding towards Uryū to close the gap between them. Practically whispering his Shikai's release command, Renji flings Zabimaru towards Uryū, but the Quincy fires an arrow and catches Renji on the cheek, drawing first blood. With an uneasy grin on his face, Renji greets Uryū, who in return merely looks upon him with a cold stare. And so, yes, as predicted by many last week, the empty space found in this week's episode is in fact filled with a brand new, never-before-seen fight between Renji and Uryū. In my opinion, bringing these two characters in particular together for a showdown is a great choice for some obvious reasons. They have history. Uryū confronted Renji during Renji's first ever appearance in the story back in the Agent of the Shinigami arc, and was ruthlessly beaten and nearly killed by him. Then they fought side by side against the 8th Espada Xyloporo during the Waco Mundo arc, actually spending quite a lot of that arc together in a somewhat unlikely pairing. And so, to me, this makes perfect sense. They know each other to the point where they've fought together before, but they're not really friends at the end of the day. At best, Renji and Uryū are acquaintances that have history fighting back to back, but that makes this a fight then with much higher stakes than any we've seen so far with Uryū. When it came to Uryū versus Senjumaru, she was a far-removed Shinigami that he'd never even met before, and of course when it came to Uryū versus Ichigo, well, with the best will in the world, it was obvious from the start that Uryū would never kill Ichigo. But Renji? Now there's an interesting proposition. Renji feels like he exists right on the cusp. Uryū probably could bring himself to kill Renji to solidify his position, but it would hurt, and even worse, would his friends ever forgive him for that transgression? So yeah, to me, this is the perfect choice of characters to give a new fight to. It exists on the edge just enough that the stakes feel appropriately high. They are former allies, yes, but they're not friends. They both have a job to do, and they'll see it through no matter what. And that's what leads to this phenomenal battle that may in fact be the core's best once again. Coming together in a new area of Wahrwelt, featuring a central fountain standing before a church, the two characters face off. Again, I have to wonder who would actually want to live here. Wahrwelt is an awesome setting for a series of fights, but in reality it looks like a desolate ghost town. Anyway, Renji says that Uryū's new cape looks good on him before deciding to figure out for sure whether or not Uryū really has betrayed them, clearly wanting to know for himself before deciding what to do next. Uryū is himself a lot more closed off with Renji, I think, than he was with Ichigo, but at the same time, it absolutely feels like he's attempting to give Renji some information here. Uryū tells Renji that Yhwach has absorbed the Soul King and taken all of his powers, which shocks the Vice Captain. It's a little weird, as I kind of thought the Gotei 13 already surmised that, or at least had a vague idea, but still. Finally, Renji asks Uryū if he's come across Ichigo, to which Uryū notes that he killed Ichigo, or at least he thought he did, but next time he'll kill him for sure. This is an interesting moment. What does Renji take from this exchange? Does it solidify in his mind that Uryū has lost his way after supposedly battling and seriously injuring Ichigo? Or is it telling that Uryū didn't kill Ichigo despite supposedly wounding him to the point where he thought he did? Either way, Renji says that he's going to destroy both Yhwach and Wahrwelt itself before rushing Uryū. Standing on the edge of the fountain, Uryū unleashes several arrows at Renji, but Renji deflects them all before leaping towards the Quincy and bringing down his Shikai. In preparation for the impending up-close physical clash, Uryū alters his bow slightly, giving it a crossguard with which to defend against Renji's sword. But he uses it to clash with Renji, the two of them locking weapons in a flurry of sparks. As they come together for the last time at the end of their string of attacks, their collective power unleashes a shockwave that obliterates the fountain, sending the water into the air. Here, Renji activates his Bankai, revealing Sou Zabimaru amidst the smoke and rubble in a flash of blinding light. If you haven't seen it yet, my supplementary video for the week's episode coverage dives deep into Renji's new Bankai and absolutely everything he displays here in this fight, meaning we're not going to go in depth into all of his new abilities right here, so make sure to check that out just in case. As Uryū asks if this is a new Bankai, Renji goes on the offensive immediately, activating his ability Zazeka and slinging a segmented whip towards Uryū, the whip exploding on contact in a massive ball of fire that sends Uryū into the sky. As the smoke clears, an unrelenting Renji follows up his first attack with another, pulling his whip around himself as he dashes towards Uryū. Sending the whip streaming forwards again, Renji slams it into Uryū and uses it to drive the Quincy into a nearby tower, swinging him round in a wide circle. Uryū frees himself from the whip as he lands on the ground, however, and comments that Renji's need to rely on physical force is getting old, before firing an arrow at the vice captain. In an awesome and unexpected move, Renji backflips into the air, catching the arrow on the roof of his foot and kicking it up into the sky. Landing on a nearby windowsill, Renji lunges for Uryū once again, this time tearing his skeletal snake arm from his body and slinging the bone whip towards his enemy from a great distance. The blade protruding from the open mouth of the snake's head at the end of the whip suddenly glows a boiling hot orange, and as Uryū fires an arrow directly at it, the sword simply melts through the arrow and almost strikes Uryū, but the Quincy sidesteps it just in time. Not only is the blade now hot enough to melt right through a nearby building, but it detonates in a colossal explosion, ripping through numerous houses with a violent fireball. There's been a bit of talk about what this fight means for Zabimaru itself. What was traditionally a simple melee-type Zanpakuto has now seemingly evolved. To me, it looks like a fire-type Zanpakuto now in this fight, but I could absolutely see an argument for it in fact being an explosion-based sword now too, which is also really cool. Anyway, leaping into the air, Uryū unleashes his signature move, Lichtregen, which Renji blocks with his Bankai, holding his gigantic ape arm upwards towards the oncoming arrows. In another awesome move, Renji then whips his arm downwards with a powerful swing, tossing the embedded arrows aside and also destroying a portion of the battleground, the sheer force of the move sending Uryū flying further into the sky. Unwilling to let him leave so easily, however, Renji then throws the snake whip up towards Uryū, controlling it with his arm. The snake whip grabs a chunk of debris in its jaws and then crashes into Uryū in mid-air like a giant flail, the stone exploding, giving Renji the opportunity to grab Uryū himself within the maw of the snake before viciously slamming the Quincy into a nearby wall. I am kind of surprised Uryū wasn't just immediately impaled by the sword inside the snake's mouth, unless Renji retracted it somehow, or perhaps Uryū used Blute to defend himself. But if that were the case, how did the jaws even close around him, with the sword potentially sticking out of his gut, unable to move in any further? Either way, Renji then closes the gap between them, and with a wild, animalistic grin, he charges a massive punch with his ape arm, fire coursing through the vent on his shoulder. Swinging his fist, Renji connects with Uryū and sends him barreling through an entire row of houses. With Uryū lying on the ground, Renji pounces upon him once again, jamming his sword into Uryū's stomach. Towering over his fallen foe, Renji activates what he perhaps expected to be his final ability, Sou Zabimaru Saga Teppo, the same ability he used to kill Mask Demasculine in the second invasion. With this moment, it certainly seems like Renji is fighting to kill, offering Uryū no quarter, as a powerful flaming apparition of a snake's head materializes above the two of them, its giant jaws poised to close shut tight on Uryū himself. I want to just quickly say that I think the way certain abilities are being depicted in this core is a lot nicer than in Core 2. For example, Saga Teppo and Getsuga Jujisho come to mind. And don't get me wrong, I like how they look in Core 2 as well, but here they are both depicted as being far less visually busy. Saga Teppo in particular just looks much, much cleaner here, and it is much easier to tell exactly what's going on. It is also considerably smaller than the version Renji uses against Masked Masculine, so maybe there's not as much power behind it. But Renji twists his hand and closes the jaws shut with a calamitous explosion, an orange fireball illuminating the cityscape. However, as the dust and fire dissipate, Renji is shocked to see that Uryū is unharmed. Unlike Masked Masculine, who was instantly reduced to ash by the attack, Uryū has defended himself by spreading blue vein all across his body, before he slowly rises from the floor like the undead from their coffins or something. Activating his Quincy Vollständig in response, Uryū vanishes within a column of crystalline blue light, the familiar church bells ringing out across Wahrwelt. From afar, we get this amazing shot of Haschwalth looking out across the cityscape, apparently watching Uryū's battle as the pillar of light ascends to the sky. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what Haschwalth is planning on really gleaning from being quite so far away, but I think this is again just supposed to signify that he has his eye on Uryū at all times. That being said, while I like this, I think at some point the anime needs to verbalise Haschwalth's distrust, even if he just talks to someone else about it, because right now, while I like the approach they're taking, there are only so many times Haschwalth can ominously stare in Uryū's direction. At what point are Haschwalth's suspicions either going to be confirmed or denied? However, Uryū emerges from the blue light, but interestingly, he's currently only using the most basic version of his holy form, nothing but the wings themselves, similarly to how other Sternritter used theirs in the second invasion, though he still doesn't have a halo. It's odd that we've seen that he doesn't need Sclaverai to achieve the fully kitted out version of his Vollständig in the past, so I'm wondering if he was just underestimating Renji here, thinking that this was the amount of power he would need. Regardless, he conjures his fletching drones and gathers them into one enormous arrow in a nice piece of animation before firing it at Renji. Through sheer physical power, Renji deflects the arrow, sending it rocketing across Wahrwelt before Uryū continues his onslaught, unleashing wave after wave of his drones at Renji. Renji brings the giant ape arm of his Bankai around and blocks them, but at the same time forces the arm to shed its fur all over the ground. Although Renji is sent spiralling into the air by the power of the drones, Uryū steps onto one of the patches of discarded fur, and suddenly each patch transforms, taking the shape of one of Hihio's massive arms. The forest of arms close in around Uryū, entombing him and locking him down, granting Renji the time he needs for his ultimate trump card. As I mentioned in my video on Renji's Bankai, as he charges his power, a golden Reiatsu swirling around him like a typhoon of fire, he notes that he needs 20 seconds to pull off this final move. A very deliberate amount of time that feels like a reference to when he said he could give Uryū 20 seconds to set up his master plan in their battle against Lille Barro. As we transition into a new flashback, we see Renji struggling in his training with Ichibei. Ichibei teaches him to pour more power into Zabimaru if he hopes to maintain his ultimate technique, as the weight of using one's true name in battle is colossal and difficult to bear. It's cool to see just how in-depth Ichibei's training actually was with these guys outside of Ichigo. He didn't just tell them what they needed to hear and then waited on the sidelines. Instead, they were granted fully bespoke training sessions with the monk, enabling them to really unlock and harness their strength. Also, since Ichibei vanishes from the manga as of chapter 613, there's quite a few characters at this point in the story that are just up and vanishing, it seems. This is a new appearance for him much later than we received in the source material, which is nice. The anime hasn't forgotten about him at least. Anyway, Renji unleashes his ultimate technique, Zaiga Zeko. If Saga Teppo wasn't meant to kill Uryū, then this certainly is. Using Hihio's ape arm to grab the bone snake whip of Orochio, Renji leaps into the air and begins to spin the whip around, gathering a flaming power inside of it. The whip is then engulfed in that fire, and as Renji continues to spin it, that fire coalesces into a twisting vortex of flame, a thunderous firestorm that threatens to consume absolutely everything. With a mighty roar, Renji brings Zyga Zeko down upon the trapped Uryū, and the entire surrounding city is swallowed up in an all-devouring ball of fire, the glow of which can be seen from across Wahrwelt. Speaking of which, we're then treated to another couple of new scenes, as Kenpachi and Mayuri both sense Renji's destructive power. Interestingly, Mayuri notes that there isn't a shred of intelligence coming from either of their spiritual pressures, which is odd considering one of the fighters is Uryū. Mayuri then mockingly notes that Kenpachi is one such fighter as well, with no intelligence in his Reiatsu, before deducing that if no one gets in their way, they should be the first to arrive at the throne room. But, I mean, we know very well that next week, someone will indeed be getting in their way. We're then treated to another new scene, where we return to Askin and the defeated Grimmjow. Standing tall over Grimmjow, Askin gloats that if he'd agreed to kill Ichigo with him, then perhaps Grimmjow wouldn't have needed to die as well. When Grimmjow mutters that he'll kill both Askin and Ichigo eventually, Askin says that he might have changed his mind if Grimmjow had begged for his life, when who should arrive on the scene behind Askin? Ichigo himself. This was perhaps the single most exciting moment for me in the episode, because it seemed to herald what I predicted last week, that we might get an actual battle between Ichigo and Askin, a small one at least, and Ichigo coming in to save Grimmjow is a fantastic change-up from the manga. I'll talk about it more in the predictions section, but I think the anime is likely pulling Ichigo's later confrontation with Askin forward massively. Again, a prediction I made last time. But we return to Renji versus Uryū to close out the episode, as the dust clears in the aftermath of Renji's colossal attack. Uryū is seen lying on the ground, though he really doesn't look that injured, all things considered. Uryū then uses Sclavarai to return to his feet, empowering himself once more by absorbing his surroundings. Numerous buildings are reduced to nothing as Uryū breaks them down, feeding them to his power, his Vollständig changing, becoming the more elaborate version that we saw used against Ichigo. Uryū then unleashes another new ability, Federzwinger, in which he entraps Renji in a cage made up of his fletching drones. Collecting themselves into elongated arrows, the drones drive themselves into the ground around the vice captain, preventing his escape, before they then ram themselves into Renji's waist from all sides, forming a Quincy cross. In what looks like a torturous power, Uryū's Federzwinger then closes in around Renji, sealing him off from the outside world before effectively electrocuting him from head to toe. In reality, this crackling blue energy is robbing Renji of his Ryoryoku, draining him of all of his power in a savage and painful way. The translation, at least on Disney Plus, is a little weird here, as Uryū initially notes that Federzwinger can drain spiritual pressure, before then saying he can deprive someone of reishi, but those are two very different things. The idea that Federzwinger can drain someone of their spiritual energy makes the most sense to me by far, as Renji is stripped not just of his Bankai, but of his Shikai too. Interestingly, the image darkens once again in a similar way to how it did when Uryū was about to blast Ichigo during their battle as well. Does this mean anything at all, or is it just a stylistic choice on the anime team's part to show that these are the moments where it seems like there's no turning back for Uryū at all? Either way, even with his power drained, Renji attempts to conjure a piece of his Bankai back, the skeletal arm of Hihio tearing itself free of Renji's own Konpaku in a moment that I speculated Renji might be using his own life force as a conduit for what little of his Bankai he can muster. Pouring all of his remaining power and energy into the arm, Renji fires Hikot's Tai-Ho in a brilliant flash of yellow, but the blast is immediately destroyed when Uryū shoots an arrow at Renji in return, the blue bolt passing through Renji's attack before striking the vice captain in the chest, ending the fight. Just before this moment, a strange white circle appears on Renji's chest. I have to wonder if this means anything, or if it's just the anime's way of showing us what Uryū's target is. But it could be a target for numerous things. The most obvious answer, and therefore likely the correct one, is that this is just a reticule of sorts that allows Uryū to aim his arrow shot. But it could also be that he is targeting something that he wants to use the antithesis on, but I've got no idea. Either way, Renji crumples to the ground, defeated, as Uryū stands tall over him, a hate-filled look in the Quincy's eyes. Uryū lists the reasons for Renji's defeat, going so far as to note that the vice captain was unconsciously trying not to kill him, which admittedly does seem unlikely to me considering the power and ferocity behind some of Renji's attacks, but there you go. Kubo is trying to make us think that these characters this week are dead, as he has drawn death arts for absolutely everyone. Renji, Omaida, Hisagi, Kione, Isane, although for some reason not Sentaro, at least at the time of recording anyway. Maybe Sentaro is the only one who tanked Lille's blast and he's going to be back on his feet next week, but I seriously doubt it. Before we get to the poem this week, there is something else to discuss. The ending. I completely missed this during my first watch, but yes, the ending is playing out in reverse. How strange. This is definitely conspicuous, culminating now in Ichigo and Uryū closing their eyes rather than opening them. It's clearly a very deliberate move, but the question is, what does it mean? Something moving in reverse would seem to indicate the antithesis is in play somewhere, but it could also be just a change to mark the halfway point of the core and how the Shinigami are now on the back foot, while Ichigo and Uryū's friendship appears to be severed, hence the closed eyes. But I like to think the antithesis is involved somewhere. Could Uryū be racking up all of these kills and injuries to then suddenly reverse them somehow later on down the line? I don't think we are far enough along in the core or the arc to really know for sure yet, but let me know your thoughts down below. As for the poem this week, unsurprisingly, it is being read by Mayuri, and it reads, "There is only you, be your own god." This is of course very fitting for someone who is always attempting to break boundaries, to push towards new heights, and the notion of god and divinity is a theme that runs throughout Mayuri's battle against, well, a literal god in the form of the left arm of the Soul King, which will begin next week in episode 34, Baby Hold Your Hand. So it definitely looks like the Friend Saga has been completely moved, likely to the very end of the core. Also, if you're wondering what the poem's image is this week, it is this shot of Ashisogi Jizo, where it's seen praying as Mayuri activates its ability to incapacitate people via its scream. There's again no Sternritter in memoriam this week, so let's move on to the predictions. As for predictions for next week, well, some of it is very self-explanatory. We're finally getting to the first of the big final fights of the series, featuring Mayuri and Nemu plus a little bit of Kenpachi versus Pernida. My assumption is that both Mayuri versus Pernida and Kyoraku versus Lille will span 2 episodes apiece, meaning episode 34 will only really cover the first half or so of the battle, perhaps up until Mayuri reveals his newly altered Bankai and uses it to devour Pernida. The reason I think that is that I think the majority of the focus on Nemu won't come until episode 35 the following week. But I also think next week might give us a little showing between Ichigo versus Askin, though admittedly it would be funny if it immediately cut to Ichigo having been turned into a rug on the floor. And I have to be honest, I do think the series will keep that moment and we might see it as early as next week. Because as of the anime, we're currently on chapter 635, but in the source material, Ichigo doesn't meet Askin until chapter 648. the same chapter Kyoraku reveals his Bankai, and then Ichigo isn't put on the ground, isn't turned into a rug, at least not that we see, until chapter 656. So these two characters potentially fight for actually a decent amount of time off screen, unless Ichigo faceplants the ground almost immediately after rushing to fight Askin. I hope the anime retains their dialogue from this scene in chapter 648 for the most part, except for obviously when Ichigo questions Askin about Grimmjow. And if I had my wish, this would be expanded into a fight, maybe even involving an Ichigo and Grimmjow team up if Grimmjow was to be healed somehow. But that opens a can of worms in itself, as Grimmjow needs to be down for Askin to leave him alone. I also wonder if Chad and Orihime and Ganju might get involved somewhere if they manage to meet up in time. Again, as of chapter 656, Chad and Orihime do regroup with Ichigo, only to be instantly defeated by Askin's gift bad ability. So again, that might get all changed around. I don't really know, but I am hopeful for something in that scenario. And so, ironically, this potential new scenario is probably what I'm most excited for next week, only because I feel like I know what to expect outside of that. But the first half or so of Mayuri and Pernida's big fight should also be amazing. I'm very curious to see how Pernida looks and acts once its hood is removed. So we'll have to wait and see. Alright everyone, but that's it for episode 33 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc titled Gate of the Sun, and my in-depth spoiler review and discussion. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Do please let me know down in the comments below what you thought of episode 33. What was your favourite moment in this week's action-packed start to the Wahrwelt arc? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. What did you think of Grimmjow giving chase to Askin and that whole comedic sequence leading to Grimmjow's fall? What did you think of the absolutely crazy and uncompromising sequence showing Lille taking down various members of the Gotei 13 with ruthless sniper shots? And of course, what did you think of the big new fight between Renji and Uryū? This truly was a tentpole, wonderful episode of the series, and I am hopeful that the rest of the core can maintain the absolute incredible string of quality that we have seen so far. It's a tall order, but I haven't seen anything so far to make me believe they can't manage it. Alright guys, but that's it from me as always. Thank you so very much for watching, and I want to end the video as we always do by saying a huge thank you and giving a massive shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much for continuing to support the channel. If you also enjoy the work that I do here over on YouTube and you too want to help out that little bit further, thank you so very much. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every video I put out just like this, and at the $2 tier or higher, you can enjoy every video of mine absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, thank you again so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.